Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at the Orbis RPG by Simon 50 Clements and Dan Voice. Now, if you've been watching my other videos, you may remember I did a first looks video for this a short time ago. I'll put a link to that down below. And let's start going through the book, shall we? We start off with Chapter 1, the World Chapter. Now, this was the sample I was originally sent for my first looks video, and I looked at it extensively there. So I'm not going to go into it too extensively again. Like I say, I'll put the link down below for the first looks video. Just to say that this chapter does a stunning job of presenting a seemingly detailed swords and sorcery world, and indeed entire cosmology, dominated by different cultures. Chapter 1 also lays out what the game's about, and it's by that bailiwick that I'm going to be reviewing the game. It claims to present the world of Uma, which is where the game takes place, as a living world where history has consequences. It's focused on humanity. The story is about humanity and demons, creatures of the outer darkness. Science and magic carry equal weight. It's a world of gritty heroism where the heroes have meteor, in essence a distillation of a character's core concept. So moving on to Chapter 2, which is the character generation, and please forgive me if I'm looking at my notes a little bit more than usual, but this is a weighty book. It's a serious tome. So in order to get everything in that I want to, I've had to make some slightly more extensive notes than normal. Now, this is the first chapter, the second chapter, where I noticed the use of the Orbis master term rather than the more standard DM or GM. I can't say I'm particularly find the invention of more such terms necessary, and for me they don't add to a game really so much as stick out more noticeably than the more common terms that we're all used to. The chapter opens with a brief analogy of a good player character being like a comfy pair of shoes that you can slip into. It then follows up with a more detailed description of meteor. And meteor seems to be the character's core concept, written as a short sentence. It is used to apply bonuses or penalties in dramatically appropriate situations. It's a concept used in a lot of storytelling and more narrative-based games at the moment, and I think it's a very nice inclusion. It just gives you that little extra incentive to think about your character's core concept when you're actually playing them and how you can do it consistently. Plus, it's a nice little reminder on your character sheet when you look and you think, how will my character be behaving in this situation? You look down at your character sheet, you've got a little sentence or a few words there that give you that core concept, and you could say, oh yes, of course, he's a barbarian from the Northern Wastes or whatever, and off you go again. There are formal guidelines in the book for creating your character's meteor, which take the form of your character's demeanour, followed by their culture, their race, and the occupation. For example, honourable, dromish warrior. Whilst some people may chafe at this restriction and may prefer a bit more of a freestyle approach to it, I think that in a setting as detailed as the Orbis setting, giving the players some kind of direction is actually a pretty good idea, since simply being turned loose can prove overwhelming to some people. There's also space for some appropriate adventuring names to be added onto your meteor as you go along, sort of deed names which you pick up as you adventure and you accumulate experience, which I think is a really nice touch and really allows you to personalize your character's advancement as you go along. The actual character generation itself is fairly standard fare. It's going to be familiar to most role players, certainly anyone who's played a D&D-esque game, and it's a mixture of choice and randomly generated elements. I've got to say, given the previous analogies and references to getting a comfortable character, the comfortable pair of shoes metaphor, I found the amount of random charts and rolling for stats a little bit odd and didn't really fit in with this initial statement. Although it's nothing that couldn't easily be modified, it just seems a little bit out of sync with the earlier goals that they were espousing. If the first chapter seemed intent on the story element of the game, then Chapter 2 really goes to town with the rules elements. There are enough concepts, backgrounds, stats, characteristics derived from stats, styles, skills, talents, and equipment detailed here to keep fans of even the crunchiest system happy. The chapter continues with a very useful mini character questionnaire to encourage players to think about their character background and ask some questions. I think this is a great inclusion, and such things should be encouraged in games to promote coming up with a more three-dimensional character. There follows a detailed breakdown of the skills available in the game. This reminded me of similar chapters in many of the OGL D20 books. The concept of a minimum level of success on rolls where you have an appropriate skill is introduced. You're always guaranteed a certain level of success based on your skill. This is a concept that makes a lot of sense to me, since it can be very frustrating for a player in a game to have your entire plan derailed by a fluke poor roll in an area your character's supposed to be an expert at. There's also the first hint of the four main types of magic featured in the game, and these are demonology, earth power, geomancy, and heart's fire. They all look very distinct and interesting, although I think the use of similar terms earth power and geomancy may cause some confusion. Skills for various low magics, alchemy, divination, etc., are also covered, and the section rounds off with a list of equipment, provisions, riding animals, etc. All fairly standard stuff for a fantasy RPG, although I did find the section on herbs very interesting, and it provides another layer of detail to the setting, and the writing is very evocative and does seem like it could have come out of one of those books that details herbs and wildflowers. We move on to Chapter 3, Combat. This chapter deals with all things violent and fighty in the game, promising that combat in Orbis is designed to be both quick and easy to resolve. Quick and easy combat that is detailed enough to be interesting, but does not become bogged down with rules and needless detail, is something of a holy grail for RPGs, with few settings getting it right. Well, let's see how Orbis does. The chapter continues, offering guidance as to when the GM should award combat bonuses, placing such situations squarely in the hands of the games master. While some people might criticise this and say it may make the game harder for less experienced GMs, I actually think the guidelines provided are quite reasonable, and the approach it takes, which doesn't handhold GMs but instead gives gentle nudges and pointers, could actually result in novice GMs learning how to better handle such responsibility and stepping up and improving their games mastering skills. So I think all in all that's a very good thing. Combat dice rolls themselves are based around a character's abilities in three styles: brawling, fencing, and ranged. This seems fine, but then the chapter breaks into a lengthy, crunchy, and somewhat bewilderingly detailed explanation of how to carry out each step of combat. This section is far too long for my liking, covering about 9 pages of fairly dense text based on the combat styles, and involves far too much maths, albeit, yes, I know it's simple math. However, math isn't something I find terribly entertaining, no matter how simple or complex. But it may appeal to people who like rulesy games. If I had one complaint about this chapter, it would be that it appears to be so thoroughly divorced from the first chapter, which really push forward the storytelling, the background element of the game, that it's almost as though they could have been written by entirely different sources or entirely different people. Although I am assured by one of the authors, 50 Clements, who I corresponded with and who was very receptive to my questions, that this is not the case, and it's simply a matter of them choosing to focus specific chapters in on what that chapter deals with. Background in one sense, rules in another, which makes a certain degree of sense, I suppose. Chapter 4 is Demonology, one of the higher magics of the setting, and it begins with a very evocative description, painting a picture of a cosmology outside the known world, inhabited by strange creatures known as demons, and talks about how they can be summoned to the world with an appropriate sorcery roll. Demonology is a skill available at various levels of mastery within the game. Each level lowers the difficulty of the dice rolls, and it's based on the willpower attribute, quite reasonably. The traditional image of the long and painful summoning ceremony is explained here with the idea that summoners have to mentally attune themselves to the alien vibrations of the planes beyond, or opening the infinite gate as it's called within the game. The chapter then goes on to discuss how demonologists may begin play, if the GM allows it, with a demonic ally and how they compile grimoires of information concerning demonic entities as they go through their career as an adventurer, allowing them to summon and bind those demons. This all sounds fairly interesting, but seems to be largely represented by a series of modifiers to the various roles a demonologist has to make. The rules are serviceable and a nice straightforward way of doing this, although it may be wise for a budding demonologist to note down the commonly used modifiers on their character sheet, just to save a bit of rules and book flipping as you go along. The authors have made the very wise decision to put a summary or a step-by-step guide to the main elements of demonology in the book. This is nicely written and very concise. It's going to be an extremely useful reference point to anyone running or playing an Orbis RPG game. I certainly had to check it a lot, given the amount of terminology used in this chapter. The section on conjuring that follows suggests some very flavourful portents that someone nearby is attempting to meddle with things best left alone, demonic energies such as animals howling and madmen raving. It's not really made clear, however, whether conjuring is specifically the summoning of demons or whether it's any form of interaction with demonic energies. Given that the next section of the chapter is about summoning specifically, I expect it is the latter, but I really didn't find this particularly clear even on a second reading. The chapter moves on to deal with various detailed rules for summoning, binding, and dismissing different types of demons. These rules are very comprehensive and detailed. I'm not going to go into them all, but I'll just pick out a few elements that I particularly liked or disliked. Now, the first one I liked was the explanation of binding demons, about how it temporarily makes the demon's energies compatible with Uma, the world, allowing them to survive in this world. But at the same time, it's like a yoke of slavery placed around their neck, binding them to the will of the person who conjured them in the first place. Binding demons and bargaining with them would seem to have great potential for roleplay. Unfortunately, in this case, it seems to have been reduced yet again to a number of templates and modifiers that the binder imposes on the demon's aura. However, I still think a lot of roleplay mileage could be got out of this, even if this chapter doesn't seem to go heavily into this side of things. Warding an area or an object against demonic interference is fairly straightforward, and the minimalist rule-centric approach seems more valid in this area. Since you're not dealing with the demons here, you're not trying to socialize with them, you're not trying to best them in a battle of wits, you're simply trying to keep them out or away from a particular object, so it works fine there. Demon wrecking, however, is very interesting. Effectively, this is a power for you to jab a mystical cattle prod into the demon's more delicate regions, making them incredibly uncomfortable and filling them with pain. Normally, this is with the aim of either torturing them or making a final bargain easier to strike with the tortured demonic entity. The section on cooperative casting and the dangers of demonology are very compelling, and they give a great portrayal of how demonology is regarded in general in the setting of Orbis, and how superstitious demonologists are, and how suspicious they are of other people, even other demonologists, people of their own kind. These are not nice people at all, as you may suspect of one who meddles in otherworldly demonic energies. This part of the game reminded me of the demonologist descriptions in early Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay editions, which is no bad thing by any account. I myself am a big fan of the earlier versions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Unfortunately, the demonologists were largely defanged in later versions, but Orbis seems to have that feel of the earlier versions there, which is a great thing. There's an interesting section following about demons who practice demonology and are capable of binding or summoning humans to their will. This is a very interesting reversal of the normal dynamic, and I think it could certainly be mined for a lot more role-playing potential. I think the idea of a demon lord with his willing or unwilling human familiar is a very interesting one. And the chapter rounds off with a bestiary of common and uncommon demons. Like all bestiaries, this is a bit of a mixed bag, with some more compelling entries than others. Personally, my favourite is the demonic imp or familiar that has a number of traits determined randomly, one of them being that the creature can perhaps piss wine. Chapter 5 moves on to deal with the next major source of magic, which is earth power, and it represents the more natural powers of the land, what we might consider to be druidic magic. This chapter appears to have a very similar layout to the demonology chapter, beginning with a very well written description of how the earth power is the spark of vital energy that flows through and connects every living thing on Uma. I particularly like the idea that most creatures are shallow pools of this energy, but druids themselves are like deep wells of the energy. The earth power practitioners receive a number of points, EPs, each day to represent the well of energy that they can call upon, their wellspring of power, to produce their effects, with earth power itself being represented by a skill in a similar manner to demonology, based on a particular attribute, in this case intuition. Earth power in Orbis relies on the concept of the Carillion aura, where each living thing is surrounded by an invisible, intangible cloak of life force. In order to use earth power, the caster first mingles the energies of their own aura with the target's aura and uses their energies to alter the aura of their target, affecting a change in their physical being or their mental being. Living power in the setting, as well as forming an aura around living creatures, also flows through ley lines between natural features, forming places of power called nodes where ley lines cross, and I can certainly see there's a hell of a lot of roleplay mileage and potential within this setting element. Earth power is cast by spending points, choosing a spell called a rote, calculating modifiers, and then applying the effects, most of which in this case seem concerned with changing shape, enhancing abilities, senses, or manipulating life energy to heal people. The list of spells and rotes supplied in this chapter is fairly extensive. It's well written, and there's also a handy guide at the end of a chapter for creating your own rotes. Chapter 6 deals with geomancy, and it follows the now familiar format from the previous two chapters. Geomancy concerns the art of creating magical effects through manipulation of energies using the mathematical shapes of power and their associated gestures. It seems to work fairly similar to earth power, using a pool of points to cast spells, although in this case they're called runes. Although geomancers do have one particularly interesting ability, which is the ability to cast a spell, or imprint it on their mind, as the book calls it, but delay the actual effects until they need it, until they form the gestures or inscribe them on a relevant surface. The chapter rounds off with a large list of runes, and I love the fact that the actual shapes of the runes are all depicted and are very clear. Actually forming these shapes or etching them on something is a great additional element to the game, in my opinion. Chapter 7 deals with the final form of higher magic, which is Heart's Fire, and it deals with those people who dwell in the city of Nostapyrax, who have the ability to manipulate an eternal flame of power that burns below the Bronze City. In practice, this works similar to other magics on a system of points, although unlike other magics that seem to have a wide variety of applications, Heart's Fire seems to be almost entirely destructive in nature, with only a few minor alternate applications, for example, producing a small amount of fire as a light. As a person uses the demonic energies of Heart's Fire, it gradually corrupts their bodies and souls, at first afflicting them with a variety of unfortunate cosmetic effects, and eventually resulting in severe mutations and corruption. Again, this bit reminded me of the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay mechanics with slightly more detailed rules. As I said earlier, no bad thing. Chapter 8 moves on to dealing with the various forms of low magic, and I was really interested in this chapter, having been a lover of low magics, cantrips, whatever you want to call them, ever since I first encountered them in the original printing of the Port Blacksand book for Advanced Fighting Fantasy, way back in the mists of time. The first type of low magic that's looked at is alchemy, and this is basically assembling the correct ingredients and using a laboratory to create normal materials such as acids and various magic potions, called amalgams in this setting. The process for producing materials, that are normal, acids, etc. It's fine and basically comes down to a fairly straightforward dice roll with a few modifiers. Unfortunately, the process for amalgams splits the potions into three elements, which are potency, power, catalyst, duration or effect, and intender, which is purpose, each with their own modifiers and distillation times. These rules are very comprehensive and pretty much cover everything you might want to create. I'm not entirely sure whether this amount of effort in terms of the rules is justified for a minor form of magic. However, if you do like customization and you don't mind a bit of basic maths, then alchemy could be right up your street. The next is divination, which is the art of foretelling the future, and it has some really interesting game mechanics such as Inquisition, which allows you to predict the result of a person's actions for 5 minutes, effectively by having them make a number of skill rolls in advance that are then used for their future actions, giving the diviner foreknowledge of what is to come. Although I can see this potentially being a problem if not everyone is enamoured or on board with this idea, I think it's possibly one of the best ways I've seen to represent this sort of power, other than by just giving some positive bonuses to the diviner. The rest of the abilities of this form of low magic have less clearly defined rules and involve vague prophecies that are received and supplied by the GM. In a way, I think this actually benefits divination more though, since it's given a lot of opportunity for roleplay unheeded by any complex rules. Divination is certainly my favourite of the low magics. Next we have dowsing, which is detecting the sympathetic resonance of certain materials, water, metal, etc., and using that resonance to track large bodies of similar material. Dowsing is represented very simply by a skill test modified by the material being searched for and the distance. I can see this being very useful for characters in the wilderness, and suggestions are given for linking it with earth power, although users of earth power can channel the resonance through their own bodies without the need of a divination rod. Next we have chirurgery, which is the use of natural properties of metals and minerals to effect minor healing changes on the aura of a living creature, allowing the healing of ailments and cleansing of the spirits, in addition to enhancing subjects in some cases. Again, this is very simply handled by test and the level of success being used to determine the extent of effect. In many ways, I found the lesser magics in the Orbis RPG to be more appealing to me than the greater ones due to their level of simplicity. I think that I would probably find it more difficult to sustain enthusiasm in the face of the modifiers and complexity of the larger systems, whereas the lesser magics are simple skill checks that add a few little additional abilities that aren't overpowering to your characters, and certainly in the case of my favourite, divination, open up a wide plethora of role-playing opportunities. Next is Chapter 9, Living in the Wild World. In the same manner as D&D and other notable fantasy RPGs, the Orbis RPG includes a chapter that is mainly for the Orbis Master, or GM. This chapter is extremely good and brushes away a lot of the earlier misgivings I may have had about the complexity in the rules, by boiling the game down to a basic percentage-based core mechanic and advising the GMs to revert to that if they believe that complex mechanics will slow the game down. I think this is a great thing, and in my mind, certainly, and in my opinion, it raises Orbis from a very complex game that could be bogged down by rules to a series of optional rules that can be used or discarded as necessary. Now, you may say that a GM can do that with any game they have, and obviously you're absolutely right. However, it's nice to know that the authors have thought about the scalability of their setting and how it could be adapted for people with different styles of play and different manners of play. Although it would have been nice to see a little bit of this more optional suggestions being touted out early on in the book. This section provides rules for adjudicating challenge difficulties, teamwork, and all manner of other situations. It also provides some play examples. I'm sure this chapter will be very useful for GMs and covers everything from lockpicking to gambling, and I suspect it will be referenced frequently. We then come to the inevitable bestiary chapter, which is chapter 10, the zoology of Uma. In this bestiary, each creature has a paragraph or two of ecology information, with the rest of the entry being devoted to the creature's stats and abilities. Now, much like some of the later D&D bestiaries, the animals are a mix of renames and adapted real-world animal analogues, occasionally dipping a toe into the prehistoric or reptilian monstrosities. However, I feel this is more acceptable in the swords and sorcery style genre, since intelligent non-humans tend to be rare, almost very seldomly encountered, with animals and strange beasts forming many of the non-human threats. There's also a large list of human archetypes that will no doubt be very handy for a GM at planning an adventure or campaign who needs some NPCs on the fly. The final chapter is chapter 11, Secrets of Orbis Mastery. And this talks about advancement in Orbis and how it's governed by two sets of points, advancement and talents points. AP are awarded for things like turning up, contributing to the session, and having moments of meta when your concept particularly shines. For approximately every 10 AP that the player receives, they get 1 TP. Guidelines are given for the approximate power level of characters with various amounts of talent points. I'm not really sure, to be perfectly honest, that 2 types of experience were necessary, but I don't see it really overcomplicating the game or causing any undue problems. Now, without going into too much detail about this chapter, since I don't really want to ruin it for anyone who may be wanting to play in an Orbis game, there's a great set of information about the metaphysics of magic in Uma that really adds a lot to the feel of the magic system, and there follows a whole series of guides and optional rules such as creating skills and having demonic player characters. This is followed by some general advice on awarding treasure and rewards for encounters. The chapter reminds me very much of the D&D Dungeon Master's Guide, but condensed down into a very readable, very manageable single chapter format, which is no mean feat by itself. So, what's my verdict on the Orbis RPG? Well, I'll start off by saying that this game is not going to be for everybody. Personally, the rules are a little bit labyrinthian and crunchy for myself. However, if you are a fan of D&D-esque or RuneQuest style games, or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the earlier editions, then you'll feel right at home with the Orbis system. I've spoken to this and corresponded with 50, one of the authors, and he was quite receptive to my queries. As I said earlier, he would be the first to admit that the game authors are aiming for something more in the RuneQuest D&D market than the new raft of narrative-based games. And in this manner, I feel they've succeeded spectacularly. They've obviously targeted the market they want, and they've gone for it all guns blazing. An Orbis RPG has all of the fantasy crunch that fans of that sort of game could want. There are a few nods towards a more narrative structure that really did sing out to me though, Meteor being a fantastic example of it, and some parts of the setting really did shine through. The lower magic rules are just one example of this. The background of the book also merits another mention because, as I said at the start of this review, it's obvious years of work have gone into it, creating a rich, textured and very evocative swords and sorcery style campaign world and setting, and even cosmology, since there are details of realms and planets, etc., outside of Uma's celestial sphere, and I'm sure they'll go into them more later. I think personally, as a fan of the more narrative games, if I was going to run Orbis, I would take the background out of the setting, this fantastic background, and either plug it into another set of rules, which is a suggestion also posited by one of the authors, or I would trim down the current rules using the very well written GM chapter to use more of solely the basic mechanic that is posited, the percentage mechanic. So, if you like D&D style games, or you're a fan of things like old Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, then Orbis is definitely worth a look. If you're not, however, but you're a fan of sword and sorcery, or you're looking to see an example of a really detailed, really evocative fantasy background in a humanocentric fantasy genre, it's still worth a look. The background has great flavour and is very interesting. I highly recommend it. So, that's my thoughts on Orbis RPG. If you have any comments, please leave them in the box down below or comment on the Google Plus links. I hope that if you've enjoyed this video, you'll click on like and subscribe to this channel. Until I see you in my next video, thank you very much for watching and thank you very much for listening.